He called me useless at dinner. The next day, I replaced his job. My name is Lilly Singh. I'm 34, and I've spent most of my adult life being underestimated by the people closest to me. When people talk about sibling rivalry, they imagine it as a phase, something that fades after high school. In my family, it calcified into hierarchy. Rohan, my older brother by 3 years, was the benchmark. Everything from his GPA to the number of LinkedIn endorsements he accumulated became the measuring stick for what success looked like. I, on the other hand, was the creative one, which was family code for aimless, impractical, and financially unreliable. It didn't matter that I'd built a user experience agency from scratch, or that my team had quietly consulted on campaigns for Fortune 500 companies. What mattered was that Rohan worked for Denham and Rayner, a global content tech firm with 5 floors in a downtown glass tower and a benefits package impressive enough to make our parents brag at Temple brunch. By the time I turned 34, I had just wrapped up the most exhausting 6 months of my life. My agency had been acquired by a larger firm in what was sold to the media as a strategic alignment of values. In reality, it was a power shuffle. They kept our logo and dropped our leadership. I went from founder to external advisor in one Zoom call. They thanked me with stock options that wouldn't vest until I'd stuck around another 3 years and handed my role to a 28-year-old Stanford graduate with better investor fluency. I left before they could schedule the next all hands. I didn't post about it on social. I just packed up the office I'd built with my own hands and drove home in silence. 2 weeks later, I was seated at our family's usual monthly dinner. My mother had cooked too much food again. My father was playing chess with Rohan on his phone between bites. And my brother was already 2 glasses of red wine deep. I was trying not to say much. Just exist. Just make it through the evening without questions. But silence, in our family, was always an opening. So, Lily, Rohan said, swirling his wine like some parody of a financial podcast host. What exactly do you do all day now? He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He already knew. My mom smiled nervously, trying to soften the blow. She's between big ideas. You know how creative minds work? Rohan chuckled and cut into his lamb chop. Big ideas don't pay rent, he said, casually, not even as an insult, just as a statement of fact. My chest burned, not from embarrassment, but from the familiarity of it all. This wasn't new, it was a rerun. I had sat through versions of this conversation since I was 21. And yet, that night, something shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that I had already spent the last 2 months questioning my worth in silence. Whatever it was, something inside me clicked. What no one at that table knew, including Rowan, was that 2 days earlier, I had completed the final round of interviews for a leadership position at Dusk Motion Studios, a fast-growing content tech company, currently eating away at Denham and Rayner's market share. What Rohan definitely didn't know was that Dusk Motion had just merged with Denham and Rayner's digital division, and the role I was interviewing for wasn't just anywhere in the company. It was a cross-functional strategic lead position, directly embedded in the vertical Rohan managed. I said nothing that night. I didn't defend myself. I didn't take the bait. I smiled, poured myself another glass of water, and made a mental note of the way my father stared at his plate, how my mother looked pained but stayed quiet, and how Rohan seemed completely comfortable sitting in the center of it all. I left dinner early. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out knowing that if the offer came through, it wouldn't just be a job. It would be a reckoning. And the next morning, it came. In a short, politely worded email, with a formal offer letter attached. Ava Torres, executive director at Dusk Motion Studios, wrote that the team was deeply impressed by your ability to translate platform gaps into actionable strategy. She ended the message with, "We're excited to see what you'll build here." I stared at the email, then at the ceiling, then back again. I accepted the position within an hour, negotiating a 3-week start window to buy myself time. Not time to prepare for the role. Time to think. Time to breathe. Time to decide what kind of story I was about to walk into. Because this wasn't just a new job. It was the beginning of the most professionally validating and personally complicated chapter of my life. And whether Rohan was ready or not, I was walking in. The first morning I walked into Dusk Motion Studios. The lobby smelled like eucalyptus and ambition. It wasn't a corporate tower like Rohan's. It was a repurposed creative warehouse downtown, where the floor-to-ceiling windows let in too much light, and the walls carried the energy of teams who moved fast and didn't wait for permission. I wore a deep green blazer, minimal jewelry, and carried nothing but a slim leather folder. The receptionist smiled as she handed me my badge and directed me to the top floor, where Ava's office overlooked the city skyline. My heart wasn't pounding like it used to before major pitches or investor meetings. It was steady, almost unnervingly so, as if my body understood this wasn't about proving something anymore. It was about showing up, fully. Ava greeted me like someone who had already made up her mind. She wasn't looking to be impressed. She was looking for execution. "Welcome aboard. Sing," she said, gesturing toward a wall, covered in whiteboard scribbles and shifting org charts. "You're not replacing anyone. This role didn't exist before. I built it for the blind spots. No one on the current team is trained to see." Her tone was neutral, professional, but there was something about the way she said it that made me pause. It meant she was watching closely, not to micromanage, but to measure whether I could actually do what my resume suggested. Over the next few days, I was slowly folded into meetings that weren't technically mine. I shadowed product reviews, joined user feedback sessions, and started mapping what Ava called invisible churn. The studio had grown quickly, but behind the scenes, client retention was shaky, and internal collaboration fractured. Departments competed instead of collaborating. Campaigns were launched without testing. Ideas died in email threads. I didn't need to be told where the gaps were. I could see them in the way people interrupted each other during meetings, the way junior staff hesitated before speaking, and the way reports were presented like apologies. I said little during that first week. Instead, I observed patterns. I noticed that Rohan's name hadn't come up once, which made sense. His team had been absorbed during the merger, but hadn't fully integrated yet. He worked from the East Wing, mostly remote, on Mondays and Fridays, and was still seen as the old guard by Dusk Motion's original team. It wasn't until Thursday afternoon, during a cross-department sync, that I finally heard it. "We need to loop in Singh on this," someone said. I looked up instinctively. "Rohan," they clarified, catching my eye. "He owns the reporting model on these metrics." That night, I stayed at my desk long after the lights on my floor had dimmed. I pulled the access logs, reviewed the historical dashboards, and pieced together how performance data had been translated over the last 6 months. Something didn't add up. The churn reports Rohan's team had delivered to the executive board were based on cohorts that no longer matched current segments, which meant the numbers looked better than they actually were. It wasn't fraud. Not yet. But it was more than just outdated methodology. It was the kind of soft manipulation that passed as insight if no one asked too many questions. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I knew the moment I brought it up, I'd shift the ground I was standing on. I needed context, not assumptions. So I scheduled a coffee with Kendra Leung, one of the senior managers who had survived the merger and now floated between divisions, like a translator between two dialects. She didn't hold back. "Your brother's sharp." "No doubt," she said, stirring her espresso. "But he's used to environments where perception is performance. Here, people expect receipts." I asked her if the executive team knew. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Ava suspects. But unless someone walks her through it line by line, she won't act. That's not how she plays. I walked out of that cafe with a knot forming in my chest. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about accountability. About whether I could be the person who didn't look away just because it was family. I wasn't ready to confront Rohan. Not yet. But I had started documenting everything. Meanwhile, Jordan, my old colleague and closest friend, called to check in. I hadn't told them I'd taken the job yet. I hadn't told anyone outside of the company. When I finally did, they paused for a moment before saying, "You know this could get messy, right? You know what he's like when he feels threatened." I did, but I also knew something else. I wasn't the same person I'd been 2 years ago. I wasn't entering this job to win a fight. I was here to do the work. If the truth came out in the process, so be it. That Friday, I received an invitation to the next quarter's strategy offsite. I scrolled through the attendee list, and there it was. Rohan Singh, Director of Platform Intelligence. One of 12 people in the executive offsite, scheduled for the following week. I closed the calendar and sat back in my chair. The timing was no longer theoretical. The collision was coming. And this time, I wasn't backing down. The offsite wasn't held at some soulless conference hotel. Dusk Motion had rented a mid-century modern retreat center in Topanga Canyon, tucked between eucalyptus groves and glassy hillsides. It looked like the kind of place where executives meditated between strategy decks and PR disasters. I arrived early, dressed in slate gray and white. Understated but deliberate. The room was already buzzing with pre-meeting chatter. I scanned the space calmly, and there he was, standing near the espresso station in his usual navy jacket, laughing too loudly at someone's comment. Rohan hadn't changed much. He still leaned into people when he wanted to appear engaged, still carried that tension in his jaw when others spoke longer than he wanted them to. He hadn't seen me yet, which gave me a few seconds to study the moment. I wasn't nervous. Not in the way I used to be. It wasn't the trembling anticipation of being seen or challenged. It was something quieter, measured. When his eyes finally landed on me, they didn't register confusion. They registered disbelief. A flicker of misalignment. The kind you feel when you see someone you thought you had buried show up in a place you considered safe. His expression held, just for a second, before the familiar mask returned. He walked over casually, with the kind of smile that could pass for warmth if you didn't know him. "Lilly," he said, drawing out the syllables like he was tasting something unfamiliar. "I wasn't expecting you here." I tilted my head slightly, holding his gaze. I could say the same. We both smiled, but neither of us meant it. Before he could say more, Ava stepped up behind him, clipboard in hand. "Great. You two already know each other," she said briskly. "That'll save us time during introductions. Let's get started." The meeting kicked off with vision slides, projections, and a rapid-fire assessment of platform weaknesses. I took notes quietly, contributing only when prompted, watching how Rohan positioned himself in every conversation. He wasn't exactly lying, but he was navigating truth with surgical precision. Every success he mentioned was couched in team effort. Every challenge subtly distanced from his domain. It was the kind of performance I'd seen dozens of times in tech leadership rooms. But watching it through the lens of history, through the lens of sibling memory, gave it new dimension. At lunch, I kept my distance. He didn't. He found me outside by the water fountain and leaned in with the same smirk I'd seen at dinner. "So this is what you've been working on," he said, biting into a protein bar, like we were sharing some inside joke. "Didn't peg you for corporate reinvention." I met his eyes, unfazed. And yet here I am. His smile tightened. "You know this department's already stretched. Adding your role means someone's losing power." I sipped my coffee, unfazed. Then maybe the system wasn't working. He paused, clearly registering that the old tactics weren't landing. Let's just be clear, he said, softer now. If this is about some family drama, if you're here to prove a point, I cut him off. Not with anger, just with clarity. I'm here to solve problems. If you become one of them, that's on you. That evening, after the sessions wrapped and people scattered for drinks and yoga classes, Ava pulled me aside. How well do you know Rohan? She asked. Not as small talk, but as audit. I weighed my answer carefully. We've known each other our whole lives, I said truthfully, then added, but I've only recently started seeing him clearly. She nodded, as if that confirmed something she already suspected. Good, because I need someone in your position who can cut through the noise. We're going to restructure how we track campaign effectiveness. And I want you to lead the working group. I didn't flinch. When do we start? The first meeting was scheduled for Monday. Rohan wasn't on the invite, but his direct reports were. The group would be reevaluating every metric currently used to assess client success, which meant we'd be opening up his playbook, line by line. I spent my weekend reviewing dashboards and digging through archived reports. The deeper I went, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Ratios that didn't balance, performance peaks that didn't match real user behavior, and buzzword-filled summaries that avoided specifics. It wasn't necessarily illegal, but it was evasive, inflated, and it wasn't sustainable. On Monday, the first working session began with introductions and polite laughter, but by the second hour, the tone shifted. When I projected the retention trend lines, one of the analysts raised a hand. These don't match the ones shared in last quarter's review, she said, confused. I stayed steady. That's because the segmentation criteria changed without documentation. We're going to correct that. There were glances exchanged around the table. One manager exhaled slowly, like someone was finally saying the thing everyone had noticed, but no one dared to name. By the end of the meeting, I had 5 follow-up requests and 3 quiet pings from team leads, thanking me for bringing clarity. That night, Jordan texted me a single sentence. He's going to retaliate. I stared at the message, then turned my phone face down. Maybe he would, but this time, I wasn't the one keeping secrets. By week 4, the shift in tone inside the company was no longer subtle. The reports I had introduced started circulating in meetings I wasn't even in. Metrics I'd rebuilt were now the basis for weekly decisions. And slowly, conversations began pivoting away from vague sentiment and back toward real numbers. But with that shift came a new kind of friction. It started with calendar blocks disappearing mysteriously from my shared schedule. Then, a presentation deck I'd carefully prepared for an interdepartmental sync was swapped out 30 minutes before the meeting. A version with errors. The kind of errors that make you look sloppy if you don't catch them fast. I stayed calm, flagged the discrepancies without assigning blame, and quietly traced the metadata later. The changes had come from Rohan's assistant's account. Whether that was a mistake or a message, I didn't ask. I just saved a backup to my private drive and moved on. That same week, Ava asked me to co-lead an internal audit of campaign lifecycle reports, something she'd previously handled herself. I knew what that meant. She trusted me, but I also knew it would draw fire. The audit involved reviewing archived documentation from both pre- and post-merger cycles, which meant spotlighting where data practices had broken down, and by extension, who had let them. During our second audit session, I found a report signed off by Rohan that contained synthetic engagement data labeled as live testing, even though the product had never entered beta. I didn't say anything that day. I printed it, dated it, and logged it into a sealed timeline I was building behind the scenes. Not for retaliation, but for protection. The kind of protection you only start considering when you've spent enough time watching the rules bend around people who smile in boardrooms and cut corners in silence. That Friday, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. Dinner Sunday. Usual time. Don't be late this time. I hadn't seen them since the new job began. I hadn't told them the full story, just that I was in strategy at a media tech firm. My father had replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was how we spoke, through symbols and subtext. That Sunday, I arrived a few minutes early, parking behind Rohan's car in the driveway, like I had so many years before. Back when I was borrowing furniture for my first apartment, and he was already managing his first team. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, I felt the shift. My mother was warm but distracted, my father unusually quiet. Rohan was already seated at the table, sipping tea, barely looking up. Dinner passed in the strange rhythm of families who have mastered the art of saying nothing directly. Talk of property taxes, airfare, childhood neighbors. Someone ran into. Finally, my mother turned to me with a gentle smile. Rohan says, "You're working in the same building now," she said lightly, pretending the information had floated to her passively. I nodded. Careful. The industry's small. My brother chuckled softly. It's smaller when people follow you into it. He didn't say it with malice, just with that familiar condescension, that way of staking claim without being explicitly cruel. I didn't take the bait. I kept eating. My silence seemed to frustrate him more than any rebuttal would have. He leaned back and folded his arms. Just be careful, Lily. This game's more complicated than it looks. When I got home that night, I found an anonymous Slack message waiting in my inbox. Saw what you fixed in the Q3 retention file. Thank you. No one else has had the guts. It came from an alias I didn't recognize, but the metadata was from someone in Rohan's former team. It was the first crack in the wall, proof that the rot wasn't invisible anymore, that others were watching too. By the following week, word had gotten out that I was preparing a presentation for Ava's quarterly executive review. Rohan wasn't on the official docket, but his performance metrics would be included, and he knew it. I knew because he started joining meetings he previously skipped. Suddenly, he was available for syncs, present in team chats, offering polished suggestions. He was trying to reassert control before the numbers did it for him. During one particularly tense prep meeting, he interrupted me mid-sentence, correcting a timeline I had sourced directly from the CRM logs. I didn't push back publicly. Instead, I requested access logs later and found that his team had backdated 2 entries. The data I used was accurate. His correction had been fabricated. I printed the logs, logged the timestamps, and archived the version history. Still, I said nothing. Not yet. Ava had taught me something without realizing it. Power doesn't come from calling people out. It comes from being so precise they can't cut around you. That weekend, I didn't go to family dinner. I didn't return my mother's messages. I needed space, because I could feel it. The shape of what was coming. Not an explosion. A shift. A moment that would tilt the story just enough to make the truth unavoidable. And when it came, I didn't plan to flinch. The quarterly executive review was scheduled for a Thursday morning, held in a wide, high-ceilinged conference space that overlooked the skyline. It was one of those meetings where everyone arrived 10 minutes early, not to network, but to measure the room. The air always felt colder on those days, as if the HVAC knew something important was about to be exposed. I wore charcoal gray, hair pinned back, not to impress anyone, but to make sure nothing distracted from the data. I had rehearsed my portion the night before until the sentences felt like steel, clear and unshakable. Ava opened with a short recap of department goals, progress, and challenges. Then she nodded to me. Lily, can you walk us through your findings on retention trend deviation? I stood, connected my laptop, and began. The first 5 slides were standard. Overview, comparison charts, benchmark summaries. Calm, objective, supported by internal data and industry benchmarks. But by slide 6, the room quieted. I presented a side-by-side comparison of the previous quarter's reported engagement data versus the corrected segmentation model I had developed over the past 4 weeks. The discrepancy was subtle in appearance but significant in impact. Nearly 9% of reported retention had been overstated due to cohort mislabeling and reporting drift. No names were mentioned. No accusations were made. But the data told its own story, and everyone in the room could follow the pattern. One executive cleared his throat. Another flipped through the printed packet I'd provided, running a finger slowly down the right column. Ava didn't interrupt. She watched. Silent, alert, thoughtful. Rohan sat across the room, arms crossed tightly over his chest, lips pressed into a thin line. He hadn't spoken yet. Not even when I opened slide 8, which showed how the misaligned segments had been flagged internally 6 months prior. Then ignored. I didn't editorialize. I simply noted the logs and source trails that documented the error chain. I ended my section with a proposed correction plan and 3 options for implementation timelines. When I finished, Ava turned to the group. "Questions?" she asked. The room stayed quiet for a beat too long. Then Rohan spoke. "I'd like to clarify that the original segmentation structure was inherited during the merger," he said, voice steady but clipped. "My team worked with what we were given, and at the time, it reflected the tools we had access to. I didn't react. I just kept my eyes on the packet." Another executive looked up. "But didn't your department lead the integration framework?" The question wasn't hostile, just matter of fact. Rohan's jaw moved slightly. "Integration was shared across several teams," he replied. "It's easy to point out flaws in hindsight." Ava leaned forward. "We're not assigning blame here, but we do need accuracy. What Lilly presented aligns with both client-side feedback and usage analytics. This is a direction we need to move in, regardless of how we got here." That was the moment. Not a takedown, not a fight, just the quiet shifting of credibility. The air in the room changed, not because anyone had won, but because the person who'd been controlling the narrative now had to answer to numbers he couldn't bend. After the meeting, as people filtered out with quiet congratulations and new assignments, Rohan stayed behind. I was organizing cables and notes when he approached, voice low and taut. "You're making this personal," he said flatly, like a statement rather than a question. I looked at him calmly. "I'm making it transparent." His nostrils flared, the way they always had when things didn't go his way. "You think this is some kind of victory. You don't know what happens when you embarrass someone in front of people who sign off on promotions." I closed my laptop slowly. Then maybe promotions should be based on substance. That evening, I walked home through the cool LA air, past restaurants, with soft light and strangers laughing about things that didn't matter. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt steady, like something had finally aligned. Not out of luck, but because the truth had been documented clearly enough that no one could distort it. Later that night, I received a message from Ezra, Ava's younger brother who worked on the platform team. We had barely spoken before. All it said was, "Respect. You're exactly what this place needed." I didn't reply right away. I just let it sit there, like a small anchor, proof that I wasn't the only one watching the patterns shift. 2 days after the review meeting, I received a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was tightly wound, like someone trying to sound calm but failing. "Rohan told us what happened at your company," she began, as if I had committed some unspoken betrayal. "We're worried about the consequences for him. Can we talk, maybe over dinner?" This Sunday, I didn't reply right away. I needed time to prepare for the conversation I knew was coming. The kind where I'd be framed as the source of chaos, regardless of how carefully I had worked to avoid personalizing any of it. That Sunday, I arrived at my parents' house with no expectations. The table was already set. My mother moving between dishes with an edge in her posture I recognized from childhood. My father didn't look up when I walked in. Rohan was already seated, scrolling his phone, like none of this involved him. We ate in silence for a few minutes before my mother finally said what she had clearly rehearsed. "We've always supported both of you," she began. "But what you did at work, it's affecting Rohan's position. It looks like you're trying to replace him." I kept my voice steady. I presented factual data. "That's my job." She frowned. "But it's your brother. Couldn't you have warned him privately, helped him adjust?" My father nodded slowly, not looking at me. "Family comes before reports, Lily, especially when the whole career is on the line." I set down my fork. "And what about my career?" I asked, not raising my voice, just asking plainly. "Does that only count when I'm invisible?" My father didn't answer. Rohan finally looked up. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder," he said, as if offering clarity. "Every success I've had, you've treated like a shadow on your path instead of a light to follow." I met his gaze without flinching. "Every success you've had has been propped up by others who were too scared to correct you." His eyes narrowed. "So now you're a martyr?" I shook my head. "No, I'm just tired of pretending that silence is kindness." After dinner, my mother followed me into the kitchen as I rinsed my glass. She kept her voice low. "He's under a lot of pressure, Lily. The leadership team is watching everything now. His performance reviews haven't been great lately. Couldn't you ease off?" I turned to her slowly. "Mom, I didn't cause that. I just refused to hide it." She hesitated. "But you knew how it would look. You knew how it would make us feel." I nodded. "Yes. And for once, I chose not to carry that weight alone." That night, I lay in bed, thinking about the way loyalty had always been defined in our family. Protect the image. Avoid conflict. Never correct the golden child, even when his foundation is cracking. I remembered moments from years ago. Group projects where I had done all the work, but let him present. Family events, where I swallowed sarcasm just to keep peace. It wasn't about revenge now. It was about clarity. And the price of telling the truth wasn't shame anymore. It was freedom. The next morning, Ava called me into her office. She didn't waste time. "I received a formal complaint from Rohan's division," she said calmly. "They're claiming that your reporting process bypassed internal peer review protocols." I didn't panic. "That's not accurate. Every report went through Tyler's team. I have the version logs if you need them." Ava nodded. "I know. I already checked. But you should be prepared. There may be more resistance. Sometimes, disruption attracts retaliation." I folded my hands carefully. "I understand. I'm not backing down." Her face didn't move, but I caught a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. Because what you're uncovering matters. It just doesn't always feel good." Later that week, Kendra massaged me quietly. "He's calling in favors, trying to reshape the narrative. Just keep your documentation airtight." I replied with a single sentence. "It already is." That Friday, I presented a new retention tool to the product team, something I'd developed with Ezra and 2 other analysts. The feedback was overwhelming. Simple, clear, finally useful. One manager said, "This is the first time I felt like the data is actually helping instead of confusing us." Rohan wasn't in that meeting, but I knew he'd hear about it. At home, my inbox remained quiet. No messages from my parents. Nah, invites to dinner. Just silence. And for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like distance. Space I had earned. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need anyone's. Because the numbers spoke, the work held, and I was still standing. 2 weeks after the executive review, Ava invited me to a closed-door session with the VP of Operations and the head of Legal Powers. The tone wasn't tense, but it was focused. They had begun quietly auditing all quarterly reports from Rohan's division over the past year. Not because of any formal accusation, but because discrepancies in revenue projections were surfacing as dusk motion prepared for a critical investor briefing. I wasn't asked to lead the audit, but I was asked to contribute what I knew. I presented a list of data inconsistencies I'd discovered, each one paired with version histories and timestamp logs, and explained where processes had been bypassed or blurred. No opinions, just facts. After I finished, the room sat in silence for a moment, before the legal director asked one question. "Did you ever speak to Rohan directly about any of these findings?" I met his gaze steadily. "No." I documented what I saw and followed internal reporting procedures. He nodded. "Good. Keep doing that." That night, my father called for the first time in weeks. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the job. He just said, "Your mother's worried. Rohan isn't sleeping. There's tension at home. Whatever's going on at your company, please don't let it destroy our family." I listened in silence, then asked a single question. "Did you ever ask him what's really happening?" My father paused, caught off guard. He said it's office politics. He's being undermined. I took a breath. Then maybe it's time you stop believing stories just because they come dressed in confidence. The following Monday, the internal audit expanded. Several junior analysts from Rohan's original team were brought in for one-on-one interviews. A pattern emerged. Delayed approvals, missing peer reviews, data relabeled after campaign deadlines. It wasn't dramatic fraud, but it was manipulation, designed to inflate metrics, protect bonuses, and mask churn. One of the analysts, a quiet woman named Lilly, confessed that she had been instructed to delete certain segments from a client loss report last fall. He said it would distract leadership from the real progress we'd made. She explained, eyes downcast. And I was on a performance plan. I didn't want to risk it. Her words weren't bitter. They were tired. The kind of tired you only hear from people who've been pressured to stay silent so long, they forget what truth sounds like. I shared what I knew with Ava, then stepped back. The investigation was now beyond me. My job was no longer to correct one person's pattern. It was to rebuild the system that allowed it. So I returned to my product work, refining tools that would make tracking client health more accessible across departments. We released the beta 2 weeks later. It received record adoption across 3 verticals within 72 hours. Ava congratulated the team in a company-wide email. My name was listed first. I didn't forward it to my parents. I didn't even mention it to Jordan. I let the silence hold it. But silence never stays still. It shifts. On a Thursday afternoon, I was pulled into an emergency sink. Esra looked pale. "Rohan just made a formal allegation against you," he said flatly. "He's claiming you accessed protected financial reports without authorization and altered performance visualizations." I didn't panic. I asked for the timestamp. When the legal team investigated, they found the report in question had been updated by a generic admin account. Logs confirmed I hadn't accessed it at all. Ava called me into her office later that day. "He's spiraling," she said quietly. "This is what happens when someone's story unravels faster than they can rewrite it." That evening, I received a Slack message from Rohan. It was short. I hope it was worth it. I didn't reply, because I knew he wasn't talking about the audit. He was talking about the image, the myth, the version of himself he had worked so hard to preserve, even when it meant distorting the truth around him. And in some corner of him, I think he believed I had broken it out of spite. But that wasn't true. I hadn't broken it. He had. I had simply stopped covering the cracks. On Friday, Ava made an announcement in our all-hands meeting. Effective immediately, a new data integrity protocol will be implemented across all reporting workflows. Department leads will undergo recertification, and governance compliance will be reviewed quarterly. She didn't mention Rohan by name. She didn't have to. Everyone understood what had changed, and who had forced the change. 3 days after the new compliance protocol was announced, I received a calendar invite, marked confidential from Ava's office. The subject line simply read, Strategic Realignment Proposal. When I arrived, the room was already quiet. Blinds drawn. Ava, standing by the window with her arms folded. She turned and smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile you give when something amusing happens. It was the kind that signals something weighty is about to shift. She gestured for me to sit, then handed me a printed brief. The board's reviewed your role across the last 2 quarters. She began. They're recommending you step in to lead data operations on an interim basis while we restructure. I looked at the document. My name was typed clearly, underlined, with a 3-month horizon and a dotted line report to the COO. Rohan's name was nowhere on the page. I didn't say yes immediately. I asked for time. Not because I wasn't ready, but because I needed to be sure my decision wasn't reactive. I spent that evening walking. No music. No distractions. Just me, and the city, and the quiet hum of headlights moving in parallel. When I finally sat down at my desk just after midnight, I reread the brief. There was no rush of triumph. No adrenaline. Just a quiet, knowing that I had reached the point I was supposed to reach, not through vengeance, but through consistency. I responded to Ava's message with a simple line, I accept the interim offer, and I'm ready to lead. The news circulated internally within 48 hours. No announcement on the company blog. No splashy email. Just a quiet shift in reporting lines. Some people messaged me directly with congratulations. Others offered cautious praise in hallway nods. But I noticed how the tone had changed. No longer brave or survivor or outsider with grit. Now, it was strategic, consistent, structured, as if what they had once dismissed as stubbornness had quietly proven itself to be leadership. At home that weekend, I told my parents during lunch. I didn't bring it up to brag. I just didn't want them to hear it from someone else. My mother stirred her tea slowly and said, So they gave you his job. It wasn't a question. It was a sentence with too many meanings. I didn't correct her. I just replied, They gave me the one he wasn't prepared to do. My father didn't say anything for a while. Then, without looking at me, he asked, Do you feel proud of this? I didn't flinch. I feel responsible for doing it well. There was silence at the table. Then my mother spoke again. Rohan says the whole thing was a political move. That people were looking for someone to blame. He says you made it easy. I put down my fork. Careful with my words. What I did was bring clarity. The rest exposed itself. She frowned. You two used to be so close. I nodded. And then he got used to taking. And I got tired of shrinking. Neither of them responded. And I didn't expect them to. On Monday, I walked into my new office. It wasn't Rohan's. That had already been cleared. It was a different space, tucked behind the analytics wing. Quieter but functional. I brought no photos, no trophies. Just a whiteboard and a clean laptop. The first thing I did was pull together a task force not of executives, but of mid-level staff. The people whose names rarely showed up in headlines but whose labor made every metric happen. I told them one thing. We're not just fixing reports. We're fixing the culture that made it easy to lie. Later that week, I received a handwritten note. No name. Just a sentence. Watching you lead is the first time I've believed that truth can survive a boardroom. I kept it in my drawer. Not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me why I had stayed. It had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was about making sure no one else had to choose between silence and self-respect. Rohan didn't reach out, but I heard through Ezra that he had taken an indefinite leave. Some said it was stress-related. Others whispered about outside, offers drying up. I didn't chase the updates. His downfall wasn't my closure. My work was. And every meeting I led, every standard I rewrote, every junior analyst I empowered to speak, without fear that was the real replacement. Not his job title, not the office, but the oxygen we created when people stopped being afraid of facts. 3 weeks into the interim role, the noise began to fade. Meetings ran cleaner. Decisions moved faster. And for the first time since I had joined the company, people stopped looking over their shoulders before speaking. I didn't lead with speeches. I led with systems. Every weekly review was transparent. Every deadline tracked. Every error acknowledged and used as a reference for smarter design. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And real began to resonate more than charm. I was walking through the lobby one afternoon when Mr. Huerta, one of our most long-term engineering leads, stopped me by the coffee machine. He had always been polite but distant, the kind of colleague who didn't say more than necessary. That day, though, he looked at me with a kind of measured respect. "I've worked here for 13 years, he said, "and I've seen directors come and go. But this is the first time I've seen a meeting end early because everyone was prepared ahead of time." "That's you." "Right." I nodded. He smiled. "Good. Keep going." It wasn't praise. It was permission. And that mattered more. Outside the office, things remained more complicated. My mother hadn't brought up the job since our lunch. My father stayed quiet, as if silence would undo the discomfort of the new power dynamic. Rohan had still not reached out, but I had noticed that he deleted his LinkedIn bio and removed all Dusk Motion affiliations. It was subtle, but it confirmed the truth that no one in my family wanted to admit he had been held accountable. Not publicly humiliated, not attacked, just quietly replaced by a system that no longer protected shortcuts. One evening, I was leaving work late when I saw Jordan waiting by the elevator. He looked hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. We hadn't spoken since the night I showed him the deck, and I had accepted that silence as closure. But now, standing face to face again, I saw something different: regret. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Back then, when you asked for help, I didn't even stop to think that maybe you were right. I just followed the current." I looked at him, calm. "You weren't the only one." He nodded. "Still, I'm sorry. And I'm proud of you." I didn't need that, but it was good to hear. Later that week, Ava invited me to present at our next investor briefing. It wasn't part of my interim role, but she said the board had specifically requested that I walk them through the new data ethics framework. I spent 2 days preparing the talk, balancing the strategy with stories from our team's transformation. No drama, just facts told with clarity. The presentation went smoothly. Clean slides, confident delivery, honest answers. When it ended, one of the investors leaned forward and said, "You've restored something here. That's rare." I smiled politely. "Thank you. We just started telling the truth." That night, I got a text from my younger cousin who had just started a summer internship at a different tech firm. My mentor told me to look up how Dusk Motion fixed their reporting crisis. She wrote, he said, "The woman who led it turned chaos into protocol." "That's you." "Right." I stared at the screen longer than I should have, then replied, "Yes, that's me." It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like ownership. For once, not a reaction to someone else's failure, but recognition for building something that lasted beyond one moment. On the way home, I passed the restaurant where it had all started. The dinner, the insult, the silence. It looked the same. The lighting still too dim. The chairs too close together. But I felt nothing as I passed. No sting. No flashback. Just a quiet release. Like the story that began in that room had finally folded into something bigger. Something steadier. I didn't know what would happen next. Whether I'd be asked to keep the role permanently, or whether someone new would be brought in. But it didn't matter anymore. I had already done the thing no one thought I could do. Notre place Rohan. But rebuild something he had quietly eroded. Integrity. Standards. Space. for truth to breathe again. That was the real power, and it never needed a spotlight to prove it. The final decision came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, quiet and unceremonious. Ava called me into the boardroom after a quarterly alignment check and simply slid a letter across the table. Permanent role, full authority, official title, no conditionals, no probationary period, no shadow of the past still clinging to the edges. I looked at her, and she didn't smile like she had before. This time, it was different. Not relief, not calculation, just trust. I folded the letter, tucked it into my bag, and nodded. That was all. No handshake photo. No champagne. Just a simple acknowledgement that the work had spoken louder than the damage ever could. Later that night, I stopped by my old apartment. The lease was still under my name, but I hadn't lived there since everything with Rohan imploded. It was mostly empty now, save for a few storage boxes and a blanket I'd forgotten to take. I stood in the middle of the room and remembered how small I used to feel in that space. Not because of the square footage, but because of the way I used to shrink around other people's ambition. I used to whisper my goals in case they sounded too bold. I used to write late at night, worried someone would read over my shoulder and dismiss the way I thought. I used to apologize for taking up space, even when it was mine. That version of me still existed in memory, but she no longer dictated the story. At work, things didn't magically stay smooth. There were still challenges. Some people left. Others resisted change. Some days I questioned if I was growing too fast, if I would lose myself in the speed of momentum, but then something shifted. Not out there, inside. I no longer needed approval to feel valid. I no longer mistook being invited for being valued. I no longer saw leadership as permission from others. I saw it as responsibility to protect the things I used to wish for in silence, dignity, transparency, and the right to be more than a name in someone else's footnote. I didn't hear from Rohan again. No apology, no explanation, but I did see him, briefly, at a conference 6 months later. He was on a smaller stage now, pitching a startup concept that felt like a patchwork of the things we had once built together. He avoided my eye. I didn't chase him, because the truth is, closure doesn't always arrive through words. Sometimes it comes through the quiet understanding that you no longer orbit the person who once tried to define your ceiling. One of the interns once asked me what the turning point was. Was it the moment you got the job, the meeting where he yelled at you, the night you pulled out the deck? I paused before answering. No, I said. It was the night I stopped needing to be understood and started acting from what I already knew was right. They looked confused, but I knew they'd understand someday, in their own way. When you've been erased, your return isn't just a comeback, it's a redefinition of the map itself. Today, when people ask what changed, I tell them nothing and everything. I'm still me. I still show up early. I still ask too many questions. I still color code strategy decks because clarity calms me. But what changed is the soil. I no longer plant seeds in places that are allergic to growth. I no longer ask for light from people who only offer shade. I don't measure worth by applause or attention, but by the integrity of the decisions I make when no one is watching. And that is a kind of freedom I never imagined possible when I sat at that dinner table, called useless, holding back tears so the room wouldn't see. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you've ever been overlooked, insulted, replaced, or made to feel small, what would happen if you stopped proving and started building? If you stopped fighting for seats at broken tables and started designing new rooms entirely? What if your quiet, consistent work was already the most powerful kind of revenge? Because sometimes, the best way to answer those who doubted you isn't through confrontation. It's by becoming undeniable.